The innate knowledge of God is extinguished or corrupted partly by ignorance and partly by wickedness. While experience testifies that the seeds of religion are sown by God in every heart, we scarcely find one man in 100 who cherishes what he has received, and not one in whom they grow to maturity, much less bear fruit in due season. Some perhaps grow vain in their own superstitions, while others revolt from God for intentional wickedness, but all degenerate from the true knowledge of Him. The fact is that no genuine piety remains in the world, but in saying that, some fall into superstition through error. I would not insinuate that their ignorance excuses them from guilt, because their blindness is always connected with pride, vanity, and contumacy. Pride and vanity are discovered when miserable men in seeking after God do not rise as they ought above their own level, but judge of Him according to their carnal stupidity, and leave the proper path of investigation in pursuit of speculations as vain as they are curious. Their conceptions of Him are formed not according to the representation He gives of Himself, but by the inventions of their own presumptuous imagination. This gulf being open, whatever course they take, they must be rushing forwards to destruction. None of their subsequent attempts for the worship or service of God can be considered as rendered to Him, because they worship not Him, but a figment of their own brains in His stead. This depravity Paul expressly remarks, professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. He had before said they became vain in their imaginations. But lest any should exculpate them, he adds that they were deservedly blinded, because not content within the bounds of sobriety, but arrogating to themselves more than was right, they willfully darkened and even infatuated themselves with pride, vanity, and perverseness. So it follows that their folly is inexcusable, which originates not only in a vain curiosity, but in false confidence and an immoderate desire to exceed the limits of human knowledge. Number 2, David's assertion that the fool has said in his heart there is no God is primarily, as we shall soon see in another place, to be restricted to those who extinguish the light of nature and willfully stupefy themselves. For we see many become hardened by bold and habitual transgression, striving to banish all remembrance of God, which the instinct of nature is still suggesting to their minds. To render their madness more detestable, he introduces them as expressly denying the existence of God, not that they deprive Him of His being, but because they rob Him of His justice and providence, shutting Him up as an idler in heaven. Now, as nothing would be more inconsistent with deity than to abandon the government of the world, leave it to fortune, and connive at the crimes of men, that they might add wantonness with impunity. Whoever extinguishes all fear of the heavenly judgment and indulges himself in security denies that there is any God. After the impious have willfully shut their own eyes, it is a righteous vengeance of God upon them to darken their understanding, so that, seeing, they may not perceive. David is the best interpreter of his own meaning, in another place where he says the wicked have no fear of God before their eyes, and again that they encourage themselves in their iniquities with a flattering persuasion that God does not see them. Though they are constrained to acknowledge the existence of God, yet they rob Him of His glory by detracting from His power. For as God, according to the testimony of Paul, cannot deny Himself, because He perpetually remains like Himself, those who feign Him to be a vain and lifeless image are truly said to deny God. It must also be remarked that though they strive against their own natural understanding, and do not desire only to banish Him thence, but even to annihilate Him in heaven, their insensibility can never prevail so as to prevent God from sometimes recalling them to His tribunal. But as no dread restrains them from violent opposition to the divine will, it is evident, as long as they are carried away with such a blind impetuosity, that they are governed by a brutish forgetfulness of God. Number 3. Thus is overthrown the vain excuse pleaded by many for their superstition, for they satisfy themselves with any attention to religion, however preposterous, not considering that the divine will is a perpetual rule to which true religion ought to be conformed, that God ever continues like Himself, that he is no spectre or phantasm, or to be metamorphosed according to the fancy of every individual. It is easy to see how superstition mocks God with hypocritical services, while it attempts to please him. For embracing only those things which he declares he disregards, it either contemptuously practices or even openly rejects what he prescribes and declares to be pleasing in his sight. Persons who introduce newly invented methods of worshiping God really worship and adore the creature of their distempered imaginations, for they would never have dared to trifle in such a manner with God if they had not first feigned a God conformable to their own false and foolish notions. Therefore the apostle pronounces a vague and unsettled notion concerning the deity to be ignorance of God. When you knew not God, he says, you did service to them which by nature were no gods. And in another place he speaks of the Ephesians as having been without God, while they were strangers to a right knowledge of the only true God. Nor in this respect is it of much importance whether you imagine to yourself one God or more, for in either case you depart and revolt from the true God, and forsaking him you have nothing left you but an execrable idol. We must therefore decide with Lactantius that there is no legitimate religion unconnected with truth. Number 4. Another sin is that they never think of God but against their inclinations, nor approach him till their reluctance is overcome by constraint, and then they are influenced not by a voluntary fear, proceeding from reverence of the divine majesty, but by a servile and constrained fear extorted by the divine judgment, which they dread because it is inevitable, at the same time that they hate it. Now to impiety and to this species of it alone is applicable that assertion of Statius that fear first made gods in the world. They whose minds are alienated from the righteousness of God earnestly desire the subversion of that tribunal, which they know to be established for the punishment of transgressions against it. With this disposition they wage war against the Lord, who cannot be deprived of his judgment. But when they apprehend his irresistible arm to be impending over their heads, unable to avert or evade it, they tremble with fear, that they may not seem altogether to despise him whose majesty troubles them. They practice some form of religion, at the same time not ceasing to pollute themselves with vices of every kind, and to add one flagitious act to another till they have violated every part of God's holy law and dissipated all his righteousness. It is certain, at least, that they are not prevented by that pretended fear of God from enjoying pleasure and satisfaction in their sins, practicing self-adulation and preferring the indulgence of their own carnal intemperance to the salutary restraints of the Holy Spirit. But that being a false and vain shadow of religion, and scarcely worthy even to be called his shadow, it is easy to infer the wide difference between such a confused notion of God and the piety which is instilled only into the minds of the faithful, and is the source of religion. Yet hypocrites who are flying from God resort to the artifices of superstition, for the sake of appearing devoted to him, whereas the whole tenor of their life ought to be a perpetual course of obedience to him. They make no scruple of rebelling against him in almost all their actions, only endeavoring to appease him with a few paltry sacrifices. Whereas he ought to be served with sanctity of life and integrity of heart, they invent frivolous trifles and worthless observances to conciliate his favor. They abandon themselves to their impurities with a greater licentiousness because they confide in being able to discharge all their duty to him by ridiculous expiations. In a word, whereas their confidence ought to be placed on him, they neglect him and depend upon themselves or on other creatures. At length they involve themselves in such a vast accumulation of errors that those sparks which enable them to discover the glory of God are smothered and at last extinguished by the criminal darkness of iniquity. That seed, which is impossible to eradicate, a sense of the existence of a deity yet remains, but so corrupted as to produce only the worst of fruits. Yet this is a further proof of what I now contend for, that an idea of God is naturally engraved on the hearts of men, since necessity extorts a confession of it even from reprobates themselves. In a moment of tranquility, they facetiously mock the divine being, and with loquacious impertinence derogate from his power. But if any despair oppress him, it stimulates him to seek him and dictates concise prayers which prove that they are not altogether ignorant of God, but that what ought to have appeared before had been suppressed by their obstinacy.